So, one of the most perplexing stories in the Hebrew Bible is the book of Job. Perhaps you know it. Job, our righteous hero, one day finds himself tormented by God. His children are killed, his fortune lost, his health taken. Job is abandoned by his wife, his friends, and his community. No reason is ever really given to Job for the afflictions he suffers. All Job gets by way of explanation is that God really doesn't need a reason. It's just left a mystery. In 1770, I suspect that the Reverend John Murray was identifying rather strongly with Job. Murray's teacher, mentor, and guide had been labeled a heretic. Murray himself, preaching that new gospel he'd been taught, the gospel of love without exception, found himself without a job, then out of a church, out of friends, and finally out of a home. Then he lost his beloved wife and their only child to illness. Finding himself alone, unable to pay his bills, and possibly facing debtor's prison, I can imagine him staring up at the sky and asking, "Why me, God?" It's not surprising that Murray chose to leave it all behind. Debt, rumor, his church, all the memories of betrayal, pain, and loss. He did what many young Englishmen of the late 18th century chose to do. When literally all else has failed, he chose to reinvent himself in the new world. I have to wonder if he was surprised that his ship actually made it to the new world. Catastrophe came calling soon enough, however, as they were traveling up the coast to Boston. The ship ran aground on a sandbar off the coast of New Jersey near Good Luck, which is now called Lanoka Harbor. The ship was too heavy to clear the sand. So Murray and a small crew moved cargo from the ship to a smaller boat, and with the goods offloaded, the bigger boat was now freed. It caught the wind and had to leave, leaving Murray's smaller boat to catch up. Naturally, this is when the wind died, leaving Murray stranded for days. Knowing that they just had to wait it out, Murray went looking for provisions, and that's when he met a local farmer, one Thomas Potter. Now here's where things get weird. It turns out that 10 years prior to the meeting, Potter had become gripped by a new theology that he'd heard about from some Pennsylvania dunkers. That's what they used to call Baptists, because they used to dunk converts into the river to baptize them. Dunkers. Okay, fine. I thought it was interesting. Anyway, Potter had built a little meeting house on his farm in order to hold discussions of this new theology. Let's see if I can get to it. Here we go. But he couldn't find anyone to preach there until Murray showed up at his farm looking for food and for his crew. It's not clear how Potter found out that Murray was a clergy person, but what was clear was that he completely ignored Murray's self-identification as a very much ex-clergy person. All Murray wanted was food and good wind. As soon as the wind turned, he and his shipmates were leaving and heading to Boston. As the story goes, Potter then said, "The wind will never change, sir, until you have delivered to us in that meeting house a message from God." As part of the deal for food and probably to shut Potter up, Murray promised that if the crew was still trapped through the weekend, he'd show up and deliver a sermon. The wind didn't return. Murray, however, did. And that is how universalism came to the United States. So today, in honor of the 250th anniversary of the arrival of universalism in America, I want to talk a little bit about Christian theology. Just a little. I'm pretty sure it won't hurt. Trust me. But before we do that, I'm going to ask you to turn to your neighbor. We're here on Zoom today, so I'm going to ask you to pretend a bit. And if the device you're using to see my face and hear my voice permits it, find one of those little squares filled with the face of one of your fellows. Doesn't matter which one. Ready? Repeat after me. Neighbor, oh neighbor, love has no boundaries. Thank you. Amen. The text for today's sermon is the recent book by David Bentley Hart, That All May Be Saved, Heaven, Hell, and Universal Salvation. It's worth noting up front that Hart is not a UU, and unlike many historical figures UUs tend to appropriate, Hart is not someone we can even claim as one of our own. It's a pity. Anyway, if you're unfamiliar with the work of this Notre Dame professor, you may be surprised to learn that he's actually a scholar of Eastern Orthodox tradition, not Roman Catholic. And he's also the author of about a dozen or so really cool books, including his own rigorous translation of the entirety of the New Testament. I find it interesting. And of course, I must recall his most important life accomplishment, his graduation from my own alma mater, the University of Maryland. Go Terps, fear the turtle. Now, as Hart tells it, universalism is very old. One thread ties it back to an early church father, Origen of Alexandria. Writing around 200 in the Common Era, Origen suggested that all people, regardless of station, regardless of background, race, or creed, and regardless of their deeds or misdeeds in life, all people would one day be reunited with God in heaven. God in heaven was where we all came from. God in heaven is where we are all going. A couple of hundred years later, this rather rosy picture was declared a heresy, and it's one reason we don't hear a lot about Origen of Alexandria today. It's probably fair to say that John Calvin is another reason. Writing over a millennium after Origen, Calvin has the rather dubious distinction, at least in my mind, of underwriting most of American theology. Calvin has a lot of pieces I find troubling. But that soapbox is a sermon for another day, maybe even a grumpy, shouty sermon series. In the meantime, I'll try to be brief. Calvin believed that the death of Jesus, the Son of God, was necessary and the only one that was sufficient to offset the insult offered by Adam and Eve when they disobeyed God's command and ate the fruit of the tree of knowledge. That original sin got them kicked out of the garden and earned all of us, their descendants, pain, suffering, and mortality. In this understanding, Jesus died for us, and it is his sacrifice that allows God to finally forgive humanity and provide the opportunity to us to avoid eternal torment in the fires of hell. I'll come back to that. But I also want to lift up Calvin's special contribution, the idea of haves and have-nots in this cosmic equation. It goes like this. According to Calvin, even with Jesus' sacrifice, not everyone will be saved. Some of us will choose not to accept it. God, who knows all things and knows who will ultimately be saved and who will not, also knows this, because he's God, right, from the beginning of time. This means that there's this special group of people who are saved. They're called the elect by Calvin. The elect were good people, born to be saved, and nothing they would do in their life would prevent their ultimate salvation. It was all laid out, right? They were destined for heaven. The rest of us, too bad, so sad, off to hell and eternal torment we would go. So the question on everybody's mind back then was, how do I know if I'm one of the elect, one of the few, one of the privileged? It's a reasonable question, I think. The answer was kind of simple. You don't. Not really, right? You'll pardon the hidden wink here because we all know. Really, we do, right? The drunk, not him. The immigrant, not her. The wastrel, fool, gadabout, liar, debtor, cheat, and general mischief maker, that other, clearly not. The elect are good people, the best people, the people from good and proper and prosperous and pious and old families. At least that's how Calvinist communities, such as the New England Puritans, tended to think. Naturally, this didn't sit well with everyone. I'm proud to say that even a quarter millennium ago, our UU ancestors were considered troublemakers, rabble rousers, and routinely declared disturbers of the peace. And 250 years later, perhaps it's not all that surprising that we are still doing that we're still wrestling. So I want to take a moment and talk about hell. Since we're speaking of our history, I want to tell you that our universalist tradition says we don't buy it. The old joke told by Thomas Starr King was that, quote, universalists believe God to be too good to damn us. Unitarians believed themselves too good to be damned. My favorite way of putting this is that universalists are called to, quote, love the hell out of the world. However you put it, our tradition states quite boldly that the idea of everlasting torment is utterly incompatible with the Bible and with the belief in a loving God. As Hart argues, quote, to say that on one hand, God is infinitely good, perfectly just, and inexhaustibly loving, and that on the other, he has created a world under such terms as oblige him either to impose or permit the imposition of eternal misery on finite rational beings is simply to embrace a complete contradiction. And no matter how ingenious the rhetorical tricks one devises to convince oneself that the claim is in fact logically coherent, morally elevating, and spiritually enlivening, the contradiction remains unresolved. All becomes mystery, but only in the sense that it requires a very mysterious ability to believe impossible things. Hart continues, consider that if justice means anything at all, it can't be that. If love means anything at all, it can't be that. If goodness means anything at all, it cannot be that. John Murray and others argued that justice, love, and goodness must mean something rather different. Universalism was the way to make sense of that, to make sense of our relationship with a truly just and truly loving God. In the book of John, chapter 8, his enemies are trying to trick Jesus into something heretical so that they could accuse him of being a blasphemer, a heretic, and at least kick him out of town. They bring forward a woman, one accused of adultery, and ask Jesus what is to be done with her. Everyone there knows that the punishment for adultery is death by stoning. Would Jesus follow the law, or would he not, and thereby condemn himself? The text shows Jesus kneeling in the dirt, writing with his finger a moment, before standing up to say, let whosoever among you is without sin cast the first stone. Then he kneels again, returning to his dirt writing. The text never says what Jesus is doing there in the dirt. Sometimes I like to imagine he's drawing lines and erasing them, drawing them again and erasing them again, over and over again. Like the lines we draw between ourselves, between the ins and the outs, the haves and the have-nots, the judges and the accused, the elect and the damned. Too many lines. It's like we can't help ourselves. And with every line we draw, there's Jesus on the other side, asking us to see the line that we have drawn and then to erase it or cross over it, to join him on the other side. I think universalism is like that, asking us to see the lines, see the division, see the differences, and then nevertheless to step over across the lines of judgment, of identity, of familiarity, of othering. If I was a poetic sort, I might suggest that the only real hell is the one that cuts me off, that keeps me apart, that severs me from myself, my community, my ultimate purpose, my lines. If I were the poetic sort, I might suggest that life is about connection, that the search for truth and meaning is a project we engage in together, and erasing the lines that society has drawn for us that we ourselves draw is what growth means, what being alive is about, and what we actually mean by acting in love, universal love, because love has no boundaries. There are plenty of lines around us today. In fact, we seem to be particularly good at drawing them. Lines between who gets health care, who gets a livable wage, who gets justice, and who does not. Americans are all about lines, aren't we? We're obsessed with them. We draw our lines and tie them into knots. We say that our justice system is a model for the world to follow, yet how can that be when the only justice Breonna Taylor gets is for the murderer who missed? We say we ought to love our neighbor as ourselves, yet how can that be when we refuse to wear a mask during a pandemic? When the average life expectancy for blacks in Chicago is 9 years less than for whites? When we actually have to debate whether to change a tax system that disproportionately affects the poor? We look at human progress and say, onward and upward forever. Yet how can that be when we poison the seas with plastic, poison the air with carbon, kill off half of the living creatures on the planet, and have the audacity to wonder aloud if climate change is really a problem we ought to deal with? If you're wondering, yes, I think universalism's message is as incisive, as powerful, and as necessary today as it ever was. I wonder if John Murray, arriving on our 21st century shores as a 21st century universalist evangelist, I wonder if he would preach about the wholeness of the great human family, the goodness of our aspirations and human trajectory, and the need for all of us to live into the glorious promise that each of us was given by right of being born a human being. I wonder if he would ask us to consider that even we, the liberal, the woke, the well-meaning, with aspirations in hearts filled with love, that even we are drawing lines, great big circles even. And as we draw those circles, those UU circles ever wider, it's the lines that still cut us off. And it is only the boundless aspiration of the ultimate good that erases those lines as fast as we attempt to draw them, erases them and calls us to cross over. A good that always stands with those on the outside and shouts to us, the rest of us, in a glad voice. Love has no boundaries. I wonder if John Murray would remind us that the good news in our UU tradition is just this. Hell is what we make. Hell is the lines we draw. Hell is ours to break free of. And the only thing we need to sacrifice is our fear that we are alone. We are not. We've been shown the way. I wonder if John Murray, now 250 years on, would want to remind us that there are no elect, no privileged, no few that are worthy or unworthy. All people have inherent worth and dignity, and all are welcome at the table of human goodness, at God's table, at the table of life, whatever we want to call it. And even as we listen to those who have been left behind, those who have been told by society and system that they do not matter, those that face oppression for no other reason that they have skins kissed by sun and sky, even now, the goal of love has no beginning and no end, and that today is the day that all voices can be lifted up in joyful song, even as all hands must take up the task of bending the arc of history to the day when all souls are recognized, all souls are cherished, and all souls can finally come home to live, love, thrive, and flourish. For now, I'll give the final word to David Bentley Hart, who writes, "Whether in the midst of our wisdom or of our folly, of truth or of error, it is the transcendental horizon of all things that continually calls us to itself, and we must obey as best we can. We may revere tradition or respect the sincerity of those who tell us all those venerable tales that we have been asked to accept on faith. But there is only one path to true freedom, and so to God. In the end, we must love the good. Love the good." Happy anniversary, Universalism. Amen.